Yet another visit by a Western leader to China. This time the German chancellor is in Beijing, saying he wants to reset ties. It comes against the backdrop of tensions between Europe and the United States. But can China be an alternative? And what does it have to offer? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. After spending decades criticising China, a succession of leaders from Western countries have been lining up to engage with its leadership. In recent months, many of them have visited Beijing seeking business opportunities. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz is the latest to land in China. Merz says Beijing must not be overlooked when tackling the big global challenges. Donald Trump's huge tariffs are said to have pushed Western countries closer to China. We'll discuss what this all means for German-Chinese trade, the world economy and politics in a moment. First, this report from Imogen Kimber.
Beijing's Forbidden City, once home to China's emperors and off-limits to foreigners. Now a popular tourist site and host to German Chancellor Friedrich Merz on his first official visit to China. Merz's next stop was a Mercedes-Benz factory. It's a joint venture between its German owners and the Chinese BAIC group. Merz is hoping this trip will get more German goods sold in China. At the moment, there's a trade deficit in China's favour, which means Beijing sells more to Germany than it buys.
The deficit between Germany and China currently stands at over $94 billion. Since 2020, within 5 years, this has quadrupled. This dynamic is not healthy. We are therefore addressing it and want to open up ways to reduce this trade deficit at our expense.
Chinese Premier Li Qiang says the two nations can increase already existing trade in automobiles and chemicals and expand cooperation in emerging fields like artificial intelligence and biopharmaceuticals. But China's high level of production is an issue Europe struggles to overcome. Besides trade, the war in Ukraine was also on the agenda.
I have asked my conversation partners to use their influence to end Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Beijing can use its influence to achieve this. We also know that signals from China are taken very seriously in Moscow. This applies to words as well as actions.
Europeans have relied on the US for help with defence, particularly in Ukraine. But the US president says he wants Europe to be more self-sufficient. Along with Trump's tariffs, many say this is why Germany and other European countries are looking elsewhere for partnerships. Several Western leaders have visited China in recent months, including the leaders of Canada, the UK, Finland and France. The Chinese president says China and the EU should increase cooperation in a changing world.
The more turbulent and intertwined the world becomes, the more China and Germany need to enhance strategic communication and increase strategic mutual trust. We should leverage the stability and vitality of China-Germany relations to promote cooperation in China-EU relations and seek common ground for a turbulent world.
Chancellor Merz and other Western leaders have recently said the post-World War international order, with dominance by the US and Europe alliance, is over. And it appears China is increasingly filling the gap being left behind by the United States. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
So plenty to unpack as we bring in our guests today who are going to discuss all this on Inside Story. In Berlin, we have Jost Wubbeke. He's managing partner at Sinolytics and a global expert on China's industrial policy, rare earths and supply chain strategy. In Washington, D.C., Harry Broadman. He's a former assistant to the US Trade Representative. And from Singapore, Dan Wang. She's an economist and director for China with the Eurasia Group. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us on Inside Story. So, Dan, let me start with you. They must be getting used to, in Beijing, seeing US allies visiting, because since December, it's not just Europeans, it's France, the UK, Finland, Germany, Canada and South Korea. They're all lining up.
Oh, well, this is a relatively surprise to Chinese leaders. But as we can see, what's interesting is their attitude of this take it or leave it towards the request or the friendly gesture from those European leaders. And especially for the case of Germany, it has more of an urgency to improve bilateral relations with China since it's highly dependent on China for trade and investment. And for the rest of Europe, there is also an urgency to de-risk from China while stabilizing the trade relation. So this is really a difficult situation for the European countries to be in.
Jost, how would you sum up the purpose of this trip by Chancellor Merz?
Yeah, let us first be clear, China hasn't been high on the priority agenda in 2025. Merz was first in India and then went to China, so this visit is actually coming quite late, but it is still the more important that this is happening now. And as you see from the delegation, also of business leaders, we have 30 business leaders being there. So economy is the main focus of this, since both countries benefit from a globalized and open trade order. So I think in that regard, this visit will be quite fundamental in also resetting the economic relations.
So, Harry, how do you see it in Washington, D.C.? Do you think there'll be unease there, particularly within the administration, and maybe even a little bit of anger from the president himself? He doesn't hide it when he's angry.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think, we welcome, I'm not speaking for the president, but I'm speaking as a U.S. specialist in China. I think we welcome others from the West, having a stronger relationship with China, improving trade ties between China and the West. And the more that we can get leaders from other industrialized countries having talks with China and making sure that both sides understand the value in such a relationship, that's very important. And I would hope that Mr. Trump would not be angered about it, but I think you never know with Mr. Trump's behavior, frankly.
Well, the backdrop for all of this, Jost, is the current situation in terms of Germany's trade with China. We can see the figures up here, and as you look over the years, the trade has grown and grown and grown. But it's interesting that in recent years, relatively, the imports from China have gone up, and the exports to China have gone down, meaning that instead of that surplus that Germany used to rely on, there's now a deficit. Some concern, is there not, in Germany about this, because it's affecting Germany's auto industry, its manufacturing industry, and leading to job losses?
Absolutely. And actually, this trade deficit is only part of the story, because there's also a lot of competition in third countries worldwide between Chinese and German manufacturers. And let us be clear, Germany and China have a very similar industrial structure. Yeah, so China is aiming for similar industries as Germany is, and you feel it especially in the automotive sector. So yes, absolutely, this is of big concern. We have also the situation that part of the trade that would, the exports that would go into the US is also diverted into Europe. So this is a big concern. I'm a bit skeptical that this will really be solved by this visit. We know from experience that, reducing trade deficits is a very hard game. So yeah, in a certain way, you can say that the German economy and industry is quite challenged by the Chinese competition.
And just how big an issue for the Chancellor is this politically?
I would say at the moment, I mean, it's not in the mainstream that the challenge of Chinese brands and competitors leads really to job losses here. So that is not, I don't think that is in the public discussion at the moment. However, he will have to find solutions, and the solutions are especially that he helps to German business to also be able to further compete in China, because they have experience. I mean, the losses of market shares is much more destructive and obvious. I mean, especially if you talk about the automotive industries, which was always a stronghold of German car makers. But now it isn't anymore, and he will really have to find solutions for enabling German companies to stay strong in the Chinese markets. And this is, of course, about market access. It is about including also the discussion about export controls. It is also about innovation, where China is not just an innovation receiver as in the past, but also a partner in innovation. So I think that will be very critical, where the German industry also will have a close look at what he can achieve.
Harry, are you feeling echoes of the US there? Because these seem to be some of the issues that got President Trump elected, and the reason or the justification he's made for introducing all these tariffs.
Yeah, I think there are obviously similarities here, and I think the more that other allies of the U.S. like Germany can try to pry open the Chinese market, that will help everybody. I think it will help China certainly, but I think more importantly, it will help reinforce the importance of global trade, global cross-border investment. And the more I think that China can, be under the discipline of a rules-based trading regime, which has not been for some time to the extent that most people would like it to, I think this visit could reinforce those points. And so I suspect that from a U.S. perspective, I think we welcome, a coalition of the willing, if you will, to try to get China to further reform and to allow for further trade flows and investment flows between the East and the West.
Dan, that was one of the things that the Chancellor was saying in Beijing. Yes, he wants more trade between Germany and China, but he wants fair trade. And the suggestion is that some of the things that China is doing are unfair. The Chinese currency, for example, is weak, deliberately dumping products which in a situation where they are actually being put on the market in Europe for less than they cost to produce in some cases, and subsidies to Chinese companies. I mean, are these accusations, in your view, founded?
The two countries are giving very different opinions regarding those issues. For China, this is actually a feature of the economy, of China's economic model. The state subsidy were quite substantial in the first 30 years of Chinese reform era. That's from the 1980s all the way to the late 2010s. But since then, the subsidies directly coming from the state has been receding. But overall, for the exports going to Europe, they're actually selling at the highest premium globally. So for Chinese producers, they are in this fierce competition in the homeland. And there's a extended working long hours for average worker. So clearly there's a lack of labor protection in that regard. But from the China perspective, there is really not much China can do when it comes to reducing the trade surplus with the rest of the world. Because one thing is that China is doubling down on its investment in innovation and automation. And the more you invest in technology, the more cost efficient the system would be. So the cost is going down. And the revaluation of the currency is actually on China's agenda. And we see this gradual revaluation throughout the past year or so. So now the Chinese leaders have higher tolerance for yuan volatility. It's in China's favor. But there wouldn't be a kind of massive revaluation for no good reason. So I guess that's where the two leaders actually run into some major disagreements. It's really hard for either side to make concession.
Jost, do you think that some of these allegations of unfair behaviour by China are made too strongly? Because you could argue this is just an amazing Chinese success story, an amazing transformation. It used to be a place that Western brands used to go and buy their parts and their components and do some of their manufacturing. Now China is producing its own products, its own brands, and those brands are now being trusted by Western consumers.
Absolutely. I mean, to be clear, the allegation against China in terms of industrial policy, I think they are to a certain degree justified. There are subsidies, there are kind of state investments into companies. So there is a clear level of state support that is going beyond what we would see as normal in Europe. However, and I think that is very important to mention, that is only one part of the Chinese competitiveness. There are at least, from a European perspective, two other factors. And one being that Chinese companies generally comply to lower standards, industrial standards, when they make their products. And in Germany, you always want to have the premium and the higher standard and so on. But from a Chinese perspective, good enough is enough. And I think that is important to mention. And the other part is definitely innovation. I think it is not by coincidence that Friedrich Merz this time is visiting a Chinese robot maker, Unitree. And that is very special because it signals that he acknowledges that China is having cutting edge here, for example, for humanoid robotics. So I think we are not doing good in Europe or elsewhere if we assume the Chinese competitiveness is based on market distortion, but it is also to a very high degree due to innovation. And I believe that China in the years and decades ahead will even become stronger in that regard, and we need to acknowledge that.
Harry, do you have some sympathy for Chancellor Merz and where he finds himself right now? He is, throughout his career politically, a proponent of free trade. What leverage does he have here? Because he can go play it hard against the Chinese, but then he ends up in a two-front war because of what's going on with the US.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is a three-way dance, if you will, with this optic of this conversation. But I would be really careful about celebrating the absence of Chinese or the reduction of Chinese subsidies. I think what has happened, and I've done a lot of work on the ground in China, in many factories, and obviously at high levels of government, the subsidies have changed from explicit subsidies to implicit subsidies. And I think the notion that China is a first-class competitor from a market reinforced system, I think that's a little bit of a falsity at this juncture. But I think the more that Western economies can deliver these kinds of messages to China, I think the more that China will open up further. But I would not be naive about what are the problems internal to China's economy, lots of contradictions. But, again, external market, power and external market forces, that improves innovation in China, that makes the labor force more productive. That's all to the good. And I would think that, the United States would celebrate those kinds of changes taking place in China. So, again, the more collective action that we can get among the G7 economies to having these conversations and trips to China, that's all to the good.
Dan, China clearly has economic clout here. When it looks at what's going on with Trump, does it see countries like Germany and the whole EU as rather timid in the way they do things?
Well, from the China perspective, the EU-China relation is certainly not nearly as essential as the China-US relation. And there is very little that China can do when it comes to improvement with a single EU member country, because China cannot sign an FTA with either Finland or Germany. It has to sign an FTA with the EU as a whole. And China-EU relation is basically at its low point, a historical standard. So when we think about where this relationship is going, it's a bit worrying because as China doubled down its commitment to build up this modern industrial supply chain, the more global market share it will take directly from Europe. As I said before, the feature of the Chinese economy is actually to produce things more efficiently than the rest of the world. And state subsidy is part of the story, but it also means China has always been having this overcapacity problem. It's only when China has climbed up this value chain and produced things that in direct competition in auto industry, in green technology, in direct competition with the European countries, with Americans, then it became a problem. So over time, we will see actually this shrinking share of GDP and shrinking share of manufactured goods from the European countries, and their wealth on the per capita level would also decrease over time if nothing can be done about China's competition.
Jost, when you look at China potentially seeing Germany and the EU as somewhat weak economically, do you think the divisions we've talked about within Europe, 27 different nations working together, and the divisions between Europe and the US, which are clear for everyone to see, do you think that plays into how China sees Europe politically?
I mean, to be honest, that is a general weakness of Europe, of the European Union, to be divided, to have many players, many stakeholders, to be slow at decisions. And I think China has been doing this, of course, to also like separate out various member states and actually make use of these different opinions within the EU. However, I think for Germany, and I think that the current government is doing better also in aligning with the other member states in the EU. That was different in the previous government. So they're already doing better. And I think when China talks to the EU, they, I would say, don't completely take seriously the EU, or they don't think it's at the same level. So I think in the end, it is good that the member states also directly face China one by one. And yeah, hopefully we will find a common ground. But we know, of course, it's not just with regard to China, but also more generally, that this is a very challenging part, of course. But I think overall, there is a very high respect now for the German delegation from the Chinese side, and they take it very seriously.
Dan, I mean, clearly in the political realm, the Chancellor will have wanted to raise things like the war in Ukraine. All Western leaders have been doing that for 4 years, trying to get China to change its position. They'll also want to oppose any effort by China to use force against Taiwan. Do you think on these sort of issues that Germany's voice is going to have any real sway in Beijing?
I'm afraid not. There is a sense that the Europeans are on very different grounds when it comes to those issues. Even if they try to improve the trade and economic relations with China, they're not going to back down on those national security issue, on Taiwan issue, on human rights issue. So for China, historically, this have been a problem. There was a very promising bilateral investment treaty in 2021, but then it was suspended over the Xinjiang human rights issue. So over time, there is realization among Chinese leaders that maybe there's some limited area in, say, climate change collaboration, in green technology, maybe even some part of the technology transfer in the European countries is possible. But beyond that, the ideology difference is vast. It's very difficult to find common ground. And the US, despite being now a bully to its allies, still the de facto spiritual leader of the Western world.
So, Harry, on this programme, since President Trump's second term, people have been talking about a new global order. The world for the last 80 years, the system we've had has changed. We're now in a world with might is right, with different big powers having spheres of influence. Do you see the EU seriously disadvantaged in this world, given it's trying to pursue this model of all of these different countries coming to consensus on any policy? In a world where might is right, can you operate without a strong man or woman for that case?
I'm not sure. I mean, sometimes, silence carries a much bigger stick than opening one mouth all the time. And I think that's one of the problems that I think the world has seen with Mr. Trump. I think, what is most important, more important than the rhetoric, is the substance of what these leaders are talking about with each other. And I think when you have smart leaders having sophisticated conversations among themselves about what can we do that is, pardon the Chinese saying, of win-win, but I think that's really important. And I think the more that the Germans can do that, the better off that China and Germany's relationship will be. That, I think, is in stark contrast with the U.S.-China relationship under the current administration, not just with China, unfortunately, but with a lot of other countries around the world. And I think the world does not react well with a bully on the stage, nor does much of the American public. So I think if Germany is smart, continuing to try to differentiate itself as to what it brings to the table in the bilateral relationship with China, but more importantly, looking for more leadership among the G7, that would be great. But I have my doubts about how effective that can be, given who is currently in the White House, I'm sorry to say.
Jost, the EU still believes in the traditional multilateral UN system. It is an interesting, and maybe there is some common ground here, that when you look at the US now not paying its dues to the UN, focusing on the board of peace rather than the UN Security Council, you could argue that China's also more invested in that traditional system than the US is now.
Rhetorically, yes, of course. I mean, they are using terms like multilateralism. They are holding up the United Nations. They are not dropping out of the climate talks and so on. So yes, in theory, you could argue there's a lot of convergence. However, I think how China is leveraging its power, it's also a different discourse that China is having. So what Europeans mean by multilateralism and what China means is, I would say there's a certain distinction. And in the end, for China as a very large power, and maybe also in a very natural way, it is also about exerting its influence. And maybe the Europeans, they are the very last ones actually to believe also into this kind of world government and true multilateralism. I don't know if everyone would agree, but at least that would be the European perspective.
Jost Wubbeke, thank you very much. Yes. Thank you, Harry Broadman and Dan Wang. If you missed any part of our discussion, perhaps you came in late, that's not a problem. You can watch it again anytime at our website, aljazeera.com. What should we discuss on the programme next time? We'd love to hear your suggestions. Post them on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or on X, look for us at AJ Inside Story. I'll see you here again very soon. Until then, from me, James Bays, and all the team, stay safe and well. Bye-bye for now.